by Dennis M. Morrison. And I'd like to dedicate this short story to my ex-father-in-law, who was very much like the Uncle Silas in this story, who had such hatred and contempt that he ripped my children away from me for a whole 5 years after an ugly divorce, and made sure that I was unable to see them. He now rests in peace, but I'm reminded of him by Uncle Silas in this story. And now, night run. Greg looked back over his shoulder, breathing a sigh of relief that no one was following. There was nothing behind him except the darkness and pine trees. Beside them, Jesse and Sandra, his younger brother and sister, huddled close for what safety he might offer. By the pale moonlight, Greg could see the fear on their small faces. It reflected his own fear, a deep trouble in his soul. He had lost everything, but he was determined not to lose them too. Mom and Dad dead, he thought. How can that be? I've been good, and so has Jesse and Sandra. We didn't deserve this. God, what do I do now? What do we do now? Tears came to his brown eyes, but he fought them back. He didn't want the kids to see him cry. Besides, a 13-year-old boy isn't supposed to cry, or so they say. He thought back to earlier in the evening. Jesse, Sandra, and himself had just pumped water into the sink to do the supper dishes. There was a loud rapping at the door, and then their Uncle Silas burst in. He was a man of burly build with a disposition just as rough and unappealing. It was hard to believe this hulking man was his mom's brother, but she had been of such a small build. Greg remembered well how Uncle Silas, well, all of his mom's family for that matter, had hated his dad. They never let Greg forget it either, but at least, he thought, they never argued over it. She stood by Dad because he was the best. Thinking of them at the moment when they had just been buried a few days before hurt Greg deep inside. He hadn't even had time to really realize that they were gone before he and his brother and sister were tossed into another nightmare. Uncle Silas came back to mind, and anger filled Greg at the very thought. He could feel it knot up in his stomach. When the large man had burst into the small kitchen, he wasted no time in getting his point across. "I want you to have Jesse and Sandra ready in the morning," he shouted, and then added, "Have all their stuff packed. I'll be by early to pick 'em up." "Pick 'em up?" Greg questioned. "Yeah, that's right, and don't give me no snot about it, you little ass. You sure ain't gonna raise them. Jesse will go with Uncle Bart, and Sandra will live with me and Aunt Sadie." But what about me? Where am I supposed to go?" Greg asked, feeling a desperation welling up inside him. "Who gives a rat's ass where you go? You're 13 and a runt like your pa was. You'll just have to fend for yourself, or maybe die trying." Silas turned to leave, but then added, "You, just have them ready. Do you hear me, boy?" Greg was jolted back to reality by the sound of a nearby hoot owl. Sandra began to whimper. Greg knelt down and gave his little sister a tight hug. "It's all right, sis. It's just an old owl, that's all." Jesse asked, "Where are we going, Greg? Uncle Silas won't find us and split us up, will he?" And Sandra cried, "Don't let him take us. Please don't let him take us." Greg's determination was renewed as he slept on the ground and said defiantly, "Ain't no one gonna split us up. No one. Now come on, we've got a long ways to go. Once we make it to Grandpa Marshall's, we'll be safe. He won't let nothing hurt any of us." But Greg was worried about his grandfather. He was sure that he would be at his own son's funeral. He was worried that something might have happened to him. Worse yet, that Uncle Silas or one of his brothers might have done something to him. Greg put that thought out of his mind. In the distance, Greg heard the sound of rushing water, and he knew that the river was nearby. There was an old boat there. It was seldom used, and tonight it might prove to be the Three Refuges avenue of escape. Greg picked up the burlap flour sack lying close by, and he had stowed away a few possessions and provisions in it. "Come on, we have to get moving. The sooner we get to old Toby Taylor's boat, the better I'll feel." It was about 20 miles to their grandfather's house, and the journey could be perilous at night. In these north woods were bare, and this time of the year they were usually quite hungry. Greg remembered that the river was probably swollen with the spring thaw runoff. He had also heard that sometimes there were still Indians round about. It hadn't been that many years ago they were still tormenting the settlers. On occasion, some Indians, when they got to drinking, could be pretty cantankerous. In the pale light of the early spring moon, a shadowy figure loomed on the road just ahead. The thought of Uncle Silas might be there, waiting, sent chills up and down Greg's spine. Soon, though, the figure melted into the darkness at the edge of the road. Greg realized the spectral visitor was nothing more than a bear. That was bad enough, but he breathed a sigh of relief that it wasn't one of his uncles hunting them down. There were lots of sounds in the night woods, but not as near as many as there would be when the warmer weather had finally set in. The hoot owls kept calling to one another, and there was the occasional cries of other denizens of the woods. But the three children moved on toward the sound of the rushing water. When the three got to the river's edge, they found the water swift and deep. It was a barrier in their flight to freedom that was fraught with hazards. Then Greg worried that the swift current might have washed the boat away. If that happened, he thought, there would be no way to cross the river safely. His eyes searched the darkness in hopes of spotting the small ark which would hopefully carry them to their promised land. At last the boat came into view, and he directed Jessie and Sandra towards it. Up and down the river were jagged blocks of ice, as the warm spring temperatures had not completed their task of laying winter to rest. Greg knew it was risky, but the risk was better than being separated from his brother and sister. The three piled into the boat, which bobbed around frantically. Greg was a strong boy. Still, it took all his strength to man the oars and propel the small craft across the waters. His efforts became much increased as he heard the hoofbeats behind him. They turned to see the hulking figure of Uncle Silas at the riverbank, shaking his fist and shouting, "You rotten good-for-nothing brat! You're no better than your old man was. Think you're getting away? I'll catch you at Fogelman's bridge. Then we'll see how smart you are." And Greg had forgotten about the bridge just a short distance ahead, and he wondered if the current would carry them down that far. Or, can I row to the other side, he wondered. Try as he did, Greg's efforts produced few results, and the rapid water carried them on towards the bridge. As the bridge came into view in the misty moonlight, the three children saw the hulking form of their Uncle Silas waiting on the bridge. He was ready to drop in and catch them. The bridge creaked and moaned under the pressure of the relentless waters. They could hear the deep guttural laughter of Uncle Silas as he prepared to enact his devious scheme. But the good Lord was watching over them, and they knew that, because as they neared the wood-frame structure there was a loud crack and a surprised yell, and the bridge collapsed, sending the timbers and Silas down the river. Greg was sure there was no way that he could survive the waters, for even an expert swimmer would have had a difficult time of it. New fear crept up on the three escapees as on the opposite side of the river another man appeared. Is it one of my other uncles? Greg wondered, a sinking feeling again coming to his stomach. But a familiar voice sounded above the din of the waves. It was their grandfather, who they were taking flight to. "Greg, over here. Too rough." "I think so." "You can do it, son. Row hard," their grandfather shouted loudly. Greg strained the oars against the water. Beads of sweat formed on his brow. It was a rough go, but with his grandfather in sight, he was spurred on. Soon the boat was tied to a tree on the opposite riverbank. Jessie and Sandra ran to their grandfather, giving him hugs and kisses, and Greg stood on the shore, sniffing and wiping his nose, trying to hide the tears. His dad and Mum were gone, but now, finally, he felt safe. The older man walked over him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, son. It's all right to cry." That was all it took, and the pent-up emotions of a boy trying to be a man flooded out. He threw his arms around his grandfather and hugged him tightly. "Why weren't you there this morning at the funeral? What happened?" "Your mom's kin wired me and said that the funeral wouldn't be till tomorrow, but then I got to thinking about how tricky they all are. I decided I'd better get to you kids tonight, and it looks like that it was a good thing I did. Old Silas was after you guys, huh?" "Yeah," Greg replied, "and he was going to split us all up." And their grandfather smiled warmly as he led the children to his nearby horses and buggy. "Well, it's all right now. There isn't anyone going to separate us, and that's for sure. Come on, let's get on home."